Good to have you back for our 185th episode of ThinkTech Hawaii's Humane Architecture. Once again, broadcasting live, me, your host, Martin Despang, from my temperate native Germany. And on the other end of the world, we have in arid Tucson, Arizona, our guest, Larry Medlin, with us again. Welcome back, Larry.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we get the first slide up, and we're still operating in very challenging times of this sort of tripartite, crisis of COVID, coronavirus, and climate and civility / social equity challenges. And DeSoto was just, always curious to learn about my culture, as you used to do, Larry, way back. You found this irritating thing that we see at the very top left, which is that conservative conference that had the stage design that some people said, hey, wait a minute, that reminds us of some very bad hate symbol that Nazis and neo-Nazis had on their collar. And I'm just saying this because we ended on a similar note, Larry, where there was a strange thing that people went into a helicopter and looked at your pavilion that was just finished and was also making some tried to make some obscure references. And again, the intentions of Frei and you having been the exact opposite, and thankfully he had you as an American on the team that was able to make that clear. And we conclude today with your pavilion, but not without showing this Briefmarke here, the stamp. It dates 1997, so 3 decades later, it's still basically celebrated, or even more celebrated, as this sort of symbol of liberating Germany, right? So again, thank you, Larry, and congratulations for that. I want to quickly translate the quote from Frei at the very bottom there. So is that your German learning lesson, or should I do the German and you do the translation?
You do the German, because I don't have my glasses. I don't have my glasses.
But that's going to prove how good your German still is. Wir suchen jene Baukunst, die aufgrund ähnlicher Prozesse versucht wie die Konstruktionen der Natur.
Yes, that's what Frei Otto always sort of focused on, understanding nature and natural forms and the principles of them, and how not just simulating forms per se, but the principles and the strategies that were embodied in those.
Yeah, and again, maybe to justify even the people who had this weird conspiracy theory, once a culture like mine, had screwed up so badly, it's probably, again, you got to earn that trust back, and thanks to you, and this architectural embodiment of liberation, we slowly but surely did. But the obstacles and oddities were multitudinal, and the American in you, Larry, it even got you close to the FBI in some odd way. Can you share that background really quickly too, to add to the collection of curiosities here?
Well, that was it was the true story. The surveyor for the process in Montreal was actually an escaped bank robber from Missouri. And he was a very good engineer and did great work. But it turned out that he was an escaped bank robber. And then he went back to prison. And then even after that, he was suspected of being involved in some crimes and things in Europe. And so and what unfortunately happened, people were asking me, was Frei Otto a criminal? They didn't make the distinction between engineer and architect of the German Pavilion in that way. But unfortunately, that all got sorted out, and people understood that his name, even Frei, was given to him by his parents, which means free, to live and act in a free and humane way.
Yeah, and particularly his mother was an active member in the German Werkbund, and so she was very much active in that sort of liberation kind of movement. So speaking American, you being American, Larry, we also should say there was also the pavilion of your country at the same World Fair. And let's go to the next slide and introduce that quickly, because we can't miss out on that one, because that's by someone who you also got to know? Share with us when and how.
That's Buckminster Fuller's pavilion for the United States at the same Expo 67 in Montreal. And right after Expo was over, I was invited to go to his home university, the Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. And when I first got there, I was invited to give a university-wide lecture, which I later found out that he attended. And then a few days later, Harold Cohen, the director of the design department, gave a dinner party for Buckminster Fuller and his wife Anne and myself and my wife at the time. And during the course of the dinner, we started talking about, our pavilions and our experiences. And I shared with him some of the problems we had and how we resolved them and so forth. And then I said, did you have any leak problems? And he was sort of hesitant. I said, well, in the German pavilion in the low saddle points where there's a flat area there where the splices are there, normally they would be sloped and the water would drain away, but at that one spot, the water could collect and under wind pressure and various other things that can drip through. So there were some water spots on the carpet just underneath that area, the exhibit area of the German pavilion. And then I said to him that I noticed right underneath the very top of the American pavilion, underneath where there's a flat area, I also noticed some water spots on the carpet there. And he just sort of smiled, and then he said, yeah, we had a little bit of a problem there. And that we discussed that in a little more detail as we just talked about. But then what was interesting about that afterwards, from that dinner, we had a wonderful conversation and talked about things and what we wanted to do in the future and so forth. He said, I'd like to invite you to come over to my house on a Sunday afternoon, which was a geodesic dome house in Carbondale. And when he invited me over there, and then we sat down on his couch, the two of us, and he had about a 2-foot diameter globe of the world. And he explained the whole sort of ecology of the world and how it works and how the warm water comes up from the Gulf Stream and moves over into Europe and the problems with that and how those cycles could get out of line. And he also at that time, John McHale, and they did the World Resources Inventory, where they were really taking inventory of mankind's resources and so forth. And so that institute that he oversaw there was really a phenomenal thing in Carbondale.
That's a great intel, and the picture we picked on the right is also showing that it used to have an enclosure of plexiglass, and we're reading that also. I mean, this comes with prototyping, comes risk taking and pioneering. And here, basically, he had tried to basically keep the pavilion cool over the summer. This is the winter condition. That's sort of easy through passive solar gain, but in the summer condition, he suggested and implemented this kind of similar to the human skin and the pores kind of breathing, but the system didn't quite work so well. And even more tragically, a few years after the expo, basically there was a massive fire in '76. And basically that made all this sort of acrylic enclosure basically melt. And that gets us to the next slide, because this is pretty much the condition of today at the very bottom, where it's basically just the skeleton that's still existing, and there's some exhibit architecture basically within. And as you were saying, remembering him in his geodesic dome home, we in Hawaii found some traces. There was Derek Correa who found this geodesic dome house recently, the picture at the top in the middle. On the left are some igloos for the homeless that a church is doing, unfortunately chopping it up with ordinary drywall. But the best Bucky Dome DeSoto and I were doing a show about was the Kaiser Dome in Waikiki, which was one of the first Bucky Fuller domes. And so that one we would like to have back. So why don't we go and tear down the horrible, hideous timeshare high-rise tower they built instead and basically rebuilt Bucky's dome. That would be fantastic. Anyways, let's go to the next slide, which basically points out, makes the relationship between the two of them. We see that that visionary proposition by Bucky Fuller at the top right, putting this sort of dome over Manhattan in New York. And you see this article here that's very current, where this massive iceberg with the size of New York City basically broke off the Antarctica. And I listened to a scientist on the radio who said, not wanting to dismiss global warming, which is an issue, but this phenomenon is more on the natural side that kind of happens. But the Antarctica we want to talk about, Larry, because what's that project down there that Frei is pointing out to and standing in front of it?
Well, that was a project that was intended for a short period of time. It was an enclosure where a crew that was working could work and extract some minerals that were in an Arctic area where you needed protection from the climate for that period of time. And then the idea was that, and that was an air inflated structure, not a geodesic dome, so that you could just deflate it and then sort of take the canopy away. And that, in Frei Otto's philosophy, that was one of his main things: the conservation of material and energy resources with appropriate considerations of ecology and the environment, but also an appropriately planned lifespan. So he was always very consciously considering, and if he had a bias, was, don't put something there and let it be there for an undue length of time instead of become an eyesore. And that was something that he always felt that was really advantageous of lightweight membrane stuff. They lent themselves to, varying lifespans, and, you could actually make material selections and configurations and organization of what was inside of it and so forth based upon, very specific planned lifespans.
Yeah. And as we were talking about before, Frei was one of the greatest collaborators and team players of all the architects. And we should add that the year 67 pavilion, the executive sort of engineer was Fritz Leonhard, pretty much. And in this one here, it was actually Kenzo Tanga, who was his architectural collaborator. And then the big engineering firm Arup was the engineer of record on this project there. And it was, gigantic. The diameter should have been 2 kilometers. So it was huge and gigantic. And the great reflective guy he basically said, after the fact, he was looking back to this project and said, maybe we were thinking too big, and there's more smaller projects in there to tackle. But as we said, it's great that both of them were these Da Vinci scientists who were thinking, both in the very macro and at the same time in the very micro, right? That really was specific about them. And so this is dating 1970. So at that time, he had moved on to projects like this, and you had been moving on, Larry, and basically returned to the United States. And the next slide, when you were lured into a retirement, Larry, there was this sort of, strawberries dipped in chocolate reception, and I had to share with the students something else what wasn't part of the speech they were doing for you. And I knew this from you, and I basically said to the students, you got to ask your grandparents and your parents about whom Larry danced with. And this is Janice Joplin up there at the very top left. And so tell us when and why you danced with Janice, Larry.
Well, that was the Mississippi River Festival Pavilion. It was a joint venture between the St. Louis Symphony and Southern Illinois University, the Edwardsville campus, which is right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. And it was intended literally to be there for 1 year. And the first concert happened exactly 9 months after the first meeting to start doing the planning. So basically all we could do is we bought an off-the-shelf tent, modified it slightly from Ringley Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, and then we, instead of having all the poles in the inside, we picked it up from above. And then if you look carefully, you can see a 270-foot-long cable truss that spanned and allowed it to cover the amphitheater for the seating, so that And the picture in the lower foreground, I think that was for a Joan Baez concert. And I think the inside the pavilion were about 2,000 people, but when the Who came there, I think were 28,000 people outside of that area. So getting back to your question about Janice Joplin, was that she was there in the second year of its performance, which is the year before she passed away. And I was there with the provost and viewing the facilities and reminding him that we told him that the pavilion had been there for 2 years already, and that back then cotton canvas with this cotton stitching would really deteriorate. Theoretically, they changed them every year, but it had been there for 2 years. So we did that. And then just ironically, at that moment, Janice Joplin was up there rehearsing for her program. So we walked up to the edge of the stage area and sat there and watched her. And they took a break, and then she came over and said, "This is really a cool place. I like it." And I said, "Well, I've always enjoyed your music, but I didn't understand that you were such an incredible dancer." And she said, "Shit, man, anybody can do that." And so there I was, in there with a formal meeting with the provost of the university and the university architect, and supposed to be a serious professional and so forth. But I just sort of stood there transfixed, And then after a while, she reached around and literally slapped me on the ass and said, "You got to move it, man. You got to get with it." And so I'm happy to say, under her inspiration, I let myself go free and learn how to dance, and I've been enjoying it in rock and roll moods and all kinds of moods ever since.
What a mutual meeting, Larry. Priceless story. And let's move on to another festival structure you've been doing, which we see here.
That one's in Big Sky, Montana, and all of these projects, like the last one, it was recognizing that in an outdoor space, you could record sound and then rebroadcast it with a slight time delay. So in doing that, you could create a reverberant field that would normally be in an indoor space, but you could create that in the outdoors. And even other aspects of it, what the musicians liked, it was you could actually change the reverberation time and so forth between singing and between the orchestral music and so forth. And so that's why a lot of the musical professionals were really excited about these options. And this one is back in when we were doing the preparation for Montreal Pavilion, Berthold Berker and I were doing some experimental models, and we came up with this idea of what's we call a reverse ridge. If you look at the profile of this, you'll see how it curls downward and then it curls back up instead of just draping it all the way across. And when you do that, when you're just doing up and down alternate ridges, there would be a flat area in the middle. But if you look at the surface curvature, it's only half the distance, so it's much more profound, which means you can pull it taut with less stress and have stability and use the material in a much more efficient way. And so that one in Big Sky, Montana, which was for the New World Symphony, a youth orchestra of all the best young musicians actually housed in Miami, were there. And the local carpenters and so forth helped build that acoustical shell there. And you see what's an entry module and then the end module, just the two modules together. But if you look in the upper right corner, you can see the same pavilion system with the entry and the end module, but it has 6 middle modules in there, so it's much longer. And that was when it was at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California, for both that year, the Rose Bowl and the Super Bowl.
Mm. And talking the material, while the previous one was very temporary, as you said, in cotton canvas, this one here was vinyl covered polyester, right?
That's right. And then even the later ones, the stadiums and so forth, they're Teflon coated fiberglass usually.
Yeah.
Or Tedlar. Some of them were done in Tedlar.
And to put that into sort of a zeitgeist perspective, Larry, that reminded me of my childhood when my father basically in our hallway in the rented 5-story, no elevator walk up, basically made it like a playground hallway. And basically the ceiling he made with a similar kind of a translucent, PVC membrane, and had hooks on different heights, altering heights on the side. So it was this undulated, skyscape that was backlit by just simple light bulbs. So this just shows from my own childhood memory how much your avant-garde basically made it into the everyday's kind of mainstream. And that gets us to the next slide, because another project my father was inspired by you was this little shading cloth there that he basically did on this, my most favorite outdoor lanai, that roof terrace that he, just started out as an architect, was just making everything from scratch and himself. And that's how I got to know Janice, not in person as you, obviously, but her live album, because my parents had that, which we show at the very top left, and I snapped it and listened to her as a great experience. So talking about that relationship, let's go to the next slide and tell us when and where that was.
That was in Dresden. I was in Europe and came over for, I think it was 3 or 4 days. And yeah, I think you had already told the story about how during the communist period, your family who lived in Dresden had to move to Manheim, and they were able to move back to a apartment building block that they had developed before. It's a significant apartment house, I should say. And then when they got the opportunity to come back, your father built this sort of penthouse apartment right at the very top. You see the skylights up above as a way of looking out with really very nice views to the surrounding landscape and so forth.
Yeah, and here the two humane masters are posing for my camera. And what you touched on is my father actually just celebrated his annual 2nd birthday anniversary, which is that tragic bombing night in Dresden, which he luckily, thanks to the intuition of his mother, my grandmother, survived, because he was not going into the bunker where unfortunately a bomb ended up killing everyone, but to a rather not so obviously safe place, which is basically where I picked you up, right? That we see at the very bottom right there.
Train station, sure.
Exactly. And that is a cast iron structure that just had flimsy wooden sheathing, not unlike your IL test pavilion. And that had very little combustible energy. So basically that burned away in no time, and the cast iron structure basically stayed. And Frei had inspired so many architects all over the world, including the high-tech crew of Grimshaw and basically Ritchie and Renzo Piano and Norman Foster. And Foster basically, after the reunification, was commissioned to basically renovate the station, and he, as a cladding, guess what he chose? Translucent fabric as an homage and tribute to your guys' work, all tracing back to your '67 pavilion, right?
Well, and probably I'm sure there were other influences on his mind, but thank you.
Yeah, but he's very you can read that he's crediting Frei and the '67 pavilion that you did together as a major influence. And go to the next slide and talking a little bit more zeitgeist here. The top row of pictures is the typology of World Fair pavilions, and the bottom one is stadiums, both very important typologies that Frei was working in. And at the very top, we can basically see what he wanted to go up against. That was the 1937 Albert Speer Pavilion by the Nazis. And he wanted to, again, overcome that. And actually, as you had shared in the last couple of shows, going back to the one before that in the Weimar Republic, which was a Mises Barcelona Pavilion. But after and there's an interesting, let's look at the collection of Briefmarken, of stamps up there, because we see your pavilion next to Mises' last big project, the National Gallery in Berlin, which we've always been saying, you know, it's soon to be done, the renovation by Chipperfield, and now it's been reopened. And so when, you know, things open up again, pandemic-wise, we can actually go there. And an interesting detail is that when Frei was visiting America on a scholarship, he basically got to know Mies, as rumors say, and they befriended each other, and he was consulting him and unofficially. So this beautiful, amazing reduction, doing the most with the least, of 2 columns on each of the 4 sides only, is basically being credited back to Frei's consulting as an amazing insight and news, right? Then we have to say, the first time when, after you guys got us back on our feet, there was a great pavilion on the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels that we see next to the stamp collection. That's by Sepp Ruf and Egon Eiermann. And Sepp Ruf, we've been featuring previously as been the architect of the Kanzler Bungalow, so the residence for the German, the equivalent to the American president. And that was, we said, you know, we like that pavilion. It's very kind of clean and crisp, but it's also very stiff. And that is because of the times, you know, Germans who had screwed up so badly, and you guys helped us back on the feet. We weren't really enjoying ourselves to a degree. And this is the great achievement of and I compare this to, I think, what Janice basically Larry did to you or with you, to just say, you know, loosen up and liberating you and express yourself and enjoy yourself. That's what you guys were doing with the 67 pavilion for us Germans, to finally give us a chance to enjoy ourselves again. So thank you for that. Not so good news is what happened to Expo pavilions, German Expo pavilions after that. And this goes deeply into the heart and soul of my hometown, because when we were hosting the World Expo in 2000, unfortunately, the second picture from the bottom right is the German pavilion. That's an embarrassment that a developer did. After the picture on the left, the beautiful competition entry by Florian Nagler, who now well-deserved is a professor at the Technical University of Munich and is doing beautiful work, basically has just been giving up because the client was just like not wanting to behave. And so the other kind of critical part is the thing we see at the top right. What is that, Larry? Which pavilion is that?
That's the Manheim. That's the Sigurd Bond's pavilion that he worked together with Frei Otto on a collaboration.
Exactly.
With paper tubes as a basic material.
Exactly, and you know, we were almost to say this is the Mannheimer Multihalle, and this is what unfortunately the German, to be more specific, my hometown of Hanover authorities were basically giving him such a hard time that they basically made him add this wooden grid shell lattice to it on the inside. And, you know, they had proven it to work in Japan, where Bahn is from, in areas with way more seismic activity. But again, the pickiness of my hometown authorities just basically, you know, ruined it to a degree that if I remember correctly, both Frei and Shigeru were basically saying, well, this is now not our project anymore, which is a shame. So needless to say, we need to get back and pick up where you had left in '67. That was actually the last and the very best pavilion representing us as a German culture. And the next typology is the one that we see at the bottom left, which is the typology of stadiums. And that one, I think we will pick up from here when we see each other again next week, because believe it or not, 28 exciting minutes are already over again. So Larry, thanks once again having been on the show, and thank the Rob Paulus studio again for the hospitality of hosting you. and look forward to see you next week again and contemplating more about the liberation of your guys' Freigeists. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Martin. Have a nice week.